He looked like a teenager on holiday, tan, lean, baby-faced. But behind the dance floor smiles and designer sunglasses, Eddie Burton wasn't a tourist. He was Britain's most unexpected drug lord. At just 23, the Liverpool native had quietly constructed a £20 million international smuggling operation, spanning from Amsterdam to Kent, all while blending into the backdrop of European party islands. When Spanish police stormed the VIP area of Ibiza's Pacha nightclub, they weren't breaking up a night out. They were ending one of the UK's most audacious trafficking networks. Burton's arrest shocked the public, but those who knew him weren't surprised. He'd been dealing drugs since the age of 10, groomed young by older dealers who used his schoolboy looks as camouflage. And he didn't climb the ranks alone. Alongside him was Shan Banks, a 25-year-old with a taste for luxury holidays and a digital footprint that exposed far more than selfies. While Burton coordinated supply lines and shipments from the continent, Banks was the UK anchor, laundering drug money, coordinating couriers, and communicating through encrypted chats. Together, they moved over 300 kilograms of cocaine, heroin, and ketamine, using lorries disguised as legitimate freight and suitcases packed on romantic getaways. They thought they were invisible, operating across borders, using aliases, and staying ahead of the law. But arrogance leaves traces, and encrypted chats, fingerprints, and flight logs don't disappear. This is the rise and fall of Eddie Burton, the schoolboy-turned-smuggler who built an empire before his mid-20s and the operation that finally caught up with him. Before the nightclub lights and smuggled millions, Eddie Burton was just another Liverpool schoolboy. But from a disturbingly early age, his life veered sharply off course. By age 10, while most children were still learning long division, Burton was already a street-level runner, a child exploited by older gang members who saw his soft features and small frame as the perfect disguise. Quiet, sharp, and eager to impress, he was used to deliver small amounts of cannabis and cocaine in the neighbourhoods around North Liverpool. Family members later described him as a tearaway, always in trouble, fighting, pushing boundaries. His natural charm masked a growing ambition. He wasn't content being a courier. He watched, learned, and absorbed everything. By his teens, he'd graduated from street work to serious local dealing, bypassing school and pushing into territory typically dominated by older men. He was cheeky, unpredictable, and fast becoming a name in Liverpool's underground. Enter Shan Banks. Slightly older, drawn in by the lifestyle, her involvement began with proximity. A self-styled influencer, she flaunted designer handbags and beachside holidays, but behind the Instagram stories was someone deeply embedded in the logistics of a criminal enterprise. Her relationship with Burton wasn't just romantic, it was tactical. She became his trusted UK handler, laundering money and maintaining contact between him and his European connections. By the time Burton turned 20, the pair were operating a network that stretched across Spain, the Netherlands, and the UK. They weren't playing at being criminals. They were orchestrating industrial-scale trafficking, smuggling multi-kilo loads, and laundering hundreds of thousands of pounds. And it all started with a child barely old enough to be in secondary school, already lost to a world that promised fast money, and gave him exactly that. By 2021, Eddie Burton wasn't just dealing, he was exporting logistics. His operation had grown far beyond Liverpool's estates, extending deep into mainland Europe. From apartments in Amsterdam to sunlit terraces in Ibiza, Burton was orchestrating shipments with the kind of precision more often seen in commercial freight firms. But his cargo wasn't legal. It was cocaine, heroin, ketamine. Class A drugs moved in the bulk, destined for British streets. The method was straightforward, but the execution was anything but. Burton worked through freight contacts, hiding hundreds of kilos in HGV lorries disguised as legitimate deliveries. On 2 known occasions, 307 kilos of Class A drugs were concealed across 2 separate lorries bound for Dover, hidden in shopping bags and modified fuel tanks. These weren't amateur concealments. They were professional, surgically prepared shipments meant to pass undetected through one of the UK's busiest entry points. But Eddie didn't manage this alone. His partner, Shan Banks, remained in the UK, acting as his logistics coordinator. From Liverpool, she arranged communications, managed finances, and liaised with couriers. She wasn't just holding money, she was making decisions. Her monthly trips to Amsterdam and Spain weren't romantic getaways, they were planning meetings and money drops. Analysis of her phone revealed that she had even smuggled drugs inside her luggage during flights, using her clean criminal history as cover. Encrypted messaging apps like Signal and WhatsApp became the operational lifeline. Using fake names and throwaway numbers, Burton and Banks discussed shipments, fingerprints, and police tactics. In one damning exchange, after a load was intercepted, Banks casually dismissed forensic risk. "Your prints have never been taken anyway, so it doesn't matter." They didn't just move drugs, they built a framework. The pair created repeatable systems, insulated themselves through layered communications, and recruited new mules, often women, who could travel with low suspicion. The operation wasn't just functioning, it was thriving, sophisticated, evolving, and deeply embedded across borders. Burton's core network included drivers, brokers, and storage contacts, many of whom were based in Europe, some recruited locally, others brought in through family ties. The scale was massive. Multi-million-pound consignments moved with calm repetition, funded by laundered cash and propped up by arrogance. They weren't street dealers anymore. They were international traffickers, embedded in nightlife, moving kilos, and convinced they were smarter than the system tracking them. For Eddie Burton, the aim wasn't chaos, it was control. Every part of his operation was meticulously managed, from the way the drugs entered the UK to how they were stored, moved, and distributed. This wasn't a messy street enterprise. It was a multi-layered trafficking business, operating like a black market corporation, with Burton at its helm and Shan Banks acting as both fixer and firewall. The scale was staggering. Across just 2 consignments, Burton's network attempted to move 307 kilograms of drugs, 90 kilos of ketamine, 167 kilos of cocaine, and 25 kilos of heroin. Hidden in plain sight, the loads were stashed inside customized lorries, one fitted with boxes beneath shopping bags, the other modified to conceal kilos within a false fuel tank. These were no haphazard stashes. They were engineered smuggling vehicles designed to beat X-ray scanners and border force inspections. The choice of lorry drivers also reflected this level of planning. One was Maris Fred Valdez, a 64-year-old Latvian national. Likely seen as expendable and low risk, he was arrested at the port of Dover and later jailed for 14 years. Burton never travelled with the product himself. That was the entire point. Distance meant deniability. While Burton hid abroad under aliases, Banks was the anchor. She kept the UK side operational, coordinating storage, handling logistics, and laundering profits. Phone data showed she'd smuggled drugs herself and arranged drop-offs. She monitored routes, advised on cover stories, and even reassured Burton about fingerprint exposure after a load was seized. The pair used encrypted messaging apps to issue orders, confirm deliveries, and track cash. Burton referred to shipments like stock, updating Banks with movements, weights, and timelines. He delegated tasks like a CEO, controlled, direct, and always 2 steps removed from the risk. And they didn't flaunt their status. There were no flashy cars or Instagram traps. Their wealth was seen in subtle cues, business-class flights, designer bags, Ibiza villas. The branding was low-key, the strategy high-stakes. It was about staying in the background while building something industrial in scale. Together, Burton and Banks weren't running drugs. They were running an import business, one powered by silence, encryption, and the belief that the law couldn't touch them. The operation might have looked seamless from the outside, but every system, no matter how well-oiled, has a weak point. For Eddie Burton and Shan Banks, the crack started small. A routine inspection, a trace of arrogance, a single set of fingerprints. And from there, the unraveling began. The first major blow came in July 2022, when UK Border Force intercepted a lorry at the port of Dover. Hidden beneath bags and boxes were 90 kilograms of ketamine and 50 kilograms of cocaine. A staggering seizure, even for seasoned officers. A month later, in August, a second lorry was stopped, this time revealing 100 to 42 kilograms of cocaine and 25 kilograms of heroin buried inside a heavily modified fuel tank. The packaging was slick, but not invisible. Forensic analysis identified Shan Banks's DNA and fingerprints on items within both consignments. Her attempt to stay in the background had failed. The encrypted chats didn't disappear either. One uncovered message saw Banks casually reassure Burton, "Your prints have never been taken anyway, so it doesn't matter." That message alone would later form a key part of the prosecution case, proving her active role and state of mind. The National Crime Agency, NCA, launched a wider surveillance operation, tracking Banks's travel history, financial patterns, and phone activity. Between June 2022 and October 2023, she flew repeatedly to the Netherlands and Spain. On 2 occasions, she physically carried drugs in her luggage, smuggling them through UK airports using her clean record as a shield. Burton, meanwhile, operated under aliases and was believed to be moving between properties in Ibiza and Amsterdam. But even from abroad, he left trails. Communications recovered by authorities mapped the blueprint of the operation. Routes, contacts, kilos, money. Encrypted didn't mean invisible, and cautious didn't mean invincible. As the pieces came together, law enforcement didn't just have suspicions. They had a timeline, a transcript, and a target. The net was tightening. By late 2023, the case against Eddie Burton and Shan Banks had shifted from surveillance to pursuit. The intelligence gathered through encrypted messages, travel records, and forensic hits gave authorities all the legal weight they needed. Now it was a matter of bringing them in. Shan Banks was the first to fall. In December 2023, armed with overwhelming digital evidence and a confirmed travel trail, officers arrested her at her home in Liverpool. She didn't resist. On her seized phone, investigators found chats coordinating shipments, arranging financial transfers, and discussing drop-offs. The tone wasn't panicked. It was businesslike, confident, and utterly damning. Meanwhile, Burton had gone underground. Operating under a false identity, he was living a double life on the party island of Ibiza, blending in with tourists while running operations from the shadows. But by then, the National Crime Agency's Joint International Crime Centre had mobilized international partners. A manhunt was underway. In March 2024, Spanish police struck. Acting on shared intelligence, they raided Pacha nightclub, one of Ibiza's most iconic venues. Burton, enjoying the VIP section under an alias, didn't have time to run. He was arrested on the spot for unrelated local drug offences, giving British authorities the opening they needed. His fingerprints, aliases, and online activity linked him to the smuggling case within hours. He was held in Spanish custody before being extradited to the UK. The flight back wasn't just a transfer, it was a victory flight for the investigators who had tracked him across borders. Once on British soil, Burton was charged with 4 counts of importing Class A and B drugs, each one tied to the shipments traced through Dover. The strength of the case was brutal in its simplicity: encrypted chat logs, forensic evidence, financial trails, travel history, and full admissions from both accused. There was no wriggle room, no fabricated alibis or denials, just a clear, digitized account of international drug trafficking, pinned down to the kilo and the day. And with Banks already in custody, the empire they built began to implode. The takedown wasn't loud, it was clinical. Everything they thought was hidden had already been mapped, logged, and time-stamped. In February 2025, at Canterbury Crown Court, one of Britain's most unlikely drug empires came to a close. The proceedings drew national attention, not just for the scale of the criminal enterprise, but for the identities of those at its centre. Eddie Burton, a 23-year-old with a baby face and a schoolboy past, and Shan Banks, 25, a glamorously styled logistics fixer who had helped orchestrate the importation of industrial volumes of Class A substances into the UK. Both defendants entered guilty pleas. Burton admitted to 4 charges of importing cocaine, heroin, ketamine, and cannabis. Banks admitted to 7 offences, including importation, money laundering, and direct coordination of criminal activity across multiple jurisdictions. The prosecution described Burton as a criminal coordinator of exceptional reach, noting his use of encrypted messaging, trusted third-party couriers, and international mobility to manage consignments valued in the tens of millions. Chat logs, flight data, and digital forensic evidence showed him directing drug shipments from Amsterdam and Ibiza while remaining physically distant from the consignments themselves. Banks, meanwhile, was described as indispensable. More than a courier, she operated as a financial handler, travel planner, and liaison, delivering instructions and managing logistics on Burton's behalf. Her own role in smuggling was proven via seized travel records and forensic evidence from Dover seizures, alongside admissions from digital messages sent via WhatsApp and Signal. During sentencing, the judge stated, "You believed that youth, encryption, and international borders would shield you. But organised crime leaves trails, and those trails have caught up with you both. The damage your drugs would have caused to UK communities cannot be overstated." Eddie Burton was sentenced to 24 years in prison. The court took into account the sophistication of the operation, the calculated use of others to carry out risk-heavy activities, and the extent to which Burton had tried to obscure his role with false identities. Shan Banks received 17 years. Despite defense arguments that she was drawn in by romantic loyalty and lifestyle promises, the judge noted her proactive involvement, including coordination of couriers and smuggling drugs herself across borders. The sentencing drew strong public commentary and statements from law enforcement. Branch Commander John Turner of the NCA said, "Burton and Banks built an empire on exploitation. Their conviction should send a clear message to others who think running drugs from abroad will protect them from UK law. It won't." The case also marked a significant win for the NCA's Joint International Crime Centre, whose collaboration with Spanish and Dutch authorities allowed the identification, location, and eventual extradition of Burton. His arrest in Ibiza had involved undercover surveillance and swift coordination across jurisdictions. Once Burton's true identity was confirmed, he was flown back to the UK under guard, closing a chapter that had begun with playground dealing and ended with international smuggling charges. More broadly, this case joins a growing list of Enquirer-era prosecutions, where once hidden networks are now being exposed by decrypted communications, cross-border partnerships, and digital forensics. The world Burton and Banks relied on, a world of secrecy, silent couriers, and false names, is shrinking. Their fall was personal, but its ripple effect is national. Doncaster isn't the kind of place you expect to see a gangland execution in the middle of the day, but on January 21st, 2021, that's exactly what happened. 20-year-old Lewis Williams was shot and killed on Wath Road, Mexborough, a quiet stretch of street that became the centre of a cold-blooded murder. It wasn't random. It wasn't messy. It was deliberate. 4 teenagers, armed with a homemade slam gun, pulled up in a stolen Jaguar, opened fire and drove off like nothing happened. Lewis's death sent a jolt through South Yorkshire. The fact that he was gunned down in broad daylight made headlines, but what made it worse was how young the killers were and how deeply entrenched they already were in gang culture. This was about more than revenge. It was about power, respect, and territory. At the heart of the story is a growing feud stretching back months. Social media threats, street-level fights, and mounting pressure between rival groups all built towards that one moment on Wath Road. And behind it, a group of teenagers who saw murder as a way of making a point. This is the story of Lewis Williams, and the fallout of a rivalry that went too far. Lewis Williams was just 20 years old when his life was brutally cut short. A young man from Doncaster, he stood over 6 feet tall, but those who knew him say his character was softer than his size suggested. Friends and family described him as funny, loyal, and full of life. Though his world wasn't free from trouble, Lewis wasn't known for violence. He had people who loved him, family who relied on him, friends who looked up to him. But in the streets he grew up in, ties to people can mean ties to problems. And Lewis, knowingly or not, had become entangled in something dangerous. At the heart of it was a bitter and growing feud, a conflict between rival groups in Doncaster and South Yorkshire, fueled by status, territory, and retaliation. Lewis had previously been linked to the Pittsmoor Shotter Boys, a name that rang out across the local scene. Though never officially charged with gang activity, his associations were known. On the other side stood a group of younger rivals, including 17-year-old Taylor Meanley. Meanley wasn't just a name on the radar, he was a figure with a reputation. Younger, bolder, and reportedly aggressive, he was becoming a known face in South Yorkshire's underground conflicts. The hostility between Lewis and Meanley escalated in the months before the shooting. There were altercations, words exchanged, social media posts that amplified small tensions into public grudges. One incident in particular pushed everything over the edge, an assault on Taylor Meanley that left him humiliated and enraged. While it was never proven that Lewis was directly involved, Meanley believed he had a hand in it, and for him, that was enough. Meanley wasn't alone. He began to confide in others, Jack Parks, Joe Anderton, and Arlind Nika. The group shared similar backgrounds, varying in age from 16 to 21. What brought them together wasn't friendship, it was a shared enemy, Lewis Williams. Together, they began to plot. The feud had gone from words to actions, from humiliation to vengeance. They weren't looking for a confrontation, they were preparing for an execution. And this wasn't spontaneous rage. In the weeks before the shooting, conversations were exchanged, messages were sent, a plan was forming. Not only would Lewis be targeted, they would make a statement. It would be public, unmistakable, and final. There's something tragic about how preventable it all was. Lewis was aware of the growing threat. He'd heard the talk, but like so many young men caught between local loyalty and everyday life, he carried on. He was seen out and about in the days before the attack, moving through town as usual. Some say he brushed off warnings. Others believe he didn't truly think they'd go that far. But the plan was already in motion. And when the group spotted Lewis on Barnsley Road near the farm food store, they didn't hesitate. What followed wasn't a street fight or a confrontation. It was a cold, calculated act. For Lewis's family, the pain is made worse by the sense that this didn't have to happen. He wasn't a hardened criminal. He wasn't unreachable. He was just a young man trying to find his way in a world where reputations can mean life or death. And in the end, it cost him everything. On January 11th, 2021, just after 4:20 p.m, the town of Mexborough fell into a silence that only follows shock. Moments earlier, the calm of Wath Road was shattered by a single, devastating blast. A homemade slam gun had been fired in broad daylight. The target was Lewis Williams. The method was execution. The four-man team behind the attack, Taylor Meanley, Jack Parks, Joe Anderton, and Arlind Nika, had been circling the area in a light blue Jaguar. It was no coincidence. Their movements had been deliberate from the start. Earlier that day, the group had gathered at a BP'd petrol station in Goldthorpe. The purpose was simple: find Lewis, take him out. What they carried with them wasn't just rage or bravado, it was a crude but lethal weapon, a slam gun made from metal tubing and a shotgun cartridge. It was brutal, basic, and fully capable of killing. As the Jaguar cruised through Mexborough, they spotted Lewis near a farm food store. The car passed once, then turned. The second time, they didn't stop. As the vehicle slowed, Meanley leaned out and pulled the trigger. The blast hit Lewis in the neck. It tore through him with such force that he collapsed instantly. There was no warning, no chance to run. The impact was fatal. He died where he fell. Witnesses described hearing a loud bang, followed by screams. Some ran for cover, others froze. Within minutes, emergency services arrived, but there was nothing they could do. Lewis was declared dead at the scene. He had been killed with devastating speed and efficiency, just yards from a supermarket, in front of people doing their afternoon shopping. The killers didn't stick around. They sped off, knowing full well that the weapon they used and the vehicle they drove would tie them to the murder. But they had a plan. Just 20 minutes later, that same Jaguar was found in Bolton upon Dearne, set ablaze in a country lane. The fire was intended to wipe away evidence, DNA, fingerprints, trace materials. It was a classic gang tactic: destroy the getaway car and walk away clean. But even in their attempt to vanish, they left traces. CCTV had already captured them in the area. Their vehicle had been seen circling. Witnesses had seen the gunshot. The fire itself became a clue: where the car was found, how quickly it had been dumped. And the biggest mistake of all? Their phones. Even as they tried to burn physical evidence, they were still messaging, still calling, still tethered to the crime by their own digital footprints. The murder of Lewis Williams was not a crime of passion. It was a planned assassination executed with military-style precision. They stalked, struck, and vanished, but they underestimated the response. What they saw as a clean hit quickly became a ticking clock, and the police were already starting to count down. For those who knew Lewis, the brutality of the killing was unbearable. For those who witnessed it, unforgettable. And for investigators, it was just the beginning of a case that would stretch far beyond one street, one shot, or one getaway car. Within minutes of the shooting, Wath Road was transformed from a quiet residential street into a major crime scene. Blue flashing lights, police tape, and stunned onlookers quickly became the backdrop to one of the most aggressive murder investigations South Yorkshire police had undertaken in years. It wasn't just the brutality of the killing that drove urgency, it was the way it had been carried out. A gang hit, broad daylight, witnessed by civilians. There was no time to waste. Officers locked down the area and began gathering CCTV from every business and private camera within reach. The BP station where the suspects had gathered was a goldmine. Clear footage showed the light blue Jaguar, faces of the occupants, clothing and timing. From there, the vehicle was tracked, seen cruising Mexborough, making its pass on Wath Road and speeding away minutes later. But the breakthrough came with the Jaguar itself. Found torched in a rural lane near Bolton upon Dearne, it was still smouldering when officers arrived. While the fire had destroyed much of the interior, enough survived to extract forensic evidence. DNA swabs and charred clothing fragments offered clues, and more importantly, the discovery narrowed the window of escape. Investigators now had a timeline. Parallel to the forensics, a digital web was forming. Detectives pulled mobile phone records, social media activity, and location data. All four suspects, Taylor Meanley, Jack Parks, Joe Anderton, and Arlind Nika, had been in contact in the hours before and after the murder. Meanley, believed to be the trigger man, had been messaging about Lewis days earlier. Conversations showed tension, threats, and talk of retaliation. It was motive in real time. Officers began working with regional units, compiling intelligence on local gang tensions. The feud between groups in Doncaster and surrounding areas, particularly involving individuals linked to the Pittsmoor shotters, had already been on their radar. Now it was clear. Lewis Williams hadn't just been a name on a list, he was a marked target. Over the next 10 days, the net tightened. On January 15th, Jack Parks was arrested during a dawn raid in Mexborough. 2 days later, Joe Anderton was picked up in Doncaster. Meanley, still only 17, was located on January the 20th. Arlind Nika, just 16, was arrested the same day, hundreds of miles away in London. In their homes, phones were seized. Clothing matched CCTV footage. Phone data aligned with the timeline of the shooting. And crucially, the homemade slam gun was found and forensically matched to the bullet that killed Lewis. Case by case, the pieces locked into place. This wasn't just smart policing, it was rapid, coordinated, and relentless. And it was working. By September 2021, all four suspects, Taylor Meanley, Jack Parks, Joe Anderton, and Arlind Nika, stood in the dock at Sheffield Crown Court. Each faced the same charge, the murder of Lewis Williams, alongside possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life. The courtroom was packed, press, family members, and a community still reeling from the sheer audacity of the killing. But in the sterile quiet of the courtroom, the full scale of the case was laid bare. Prosecutors opened with a clear assertion: this was a targeted execution, not a spontaneous act. Jurors were shown CCTV footage of the Jaguar cruising past Lewis, doubling back, and then approaching again for the fatal shot. The prosecution described the movements as choreographed, a planned mission executed with military-like precision. They highlighted the role of each defendant. Meanly, despite being just 17 at the time, was said to have pulled the trigger. Parks had helped organize and drive the car. Anderton and Nika were active participants, acting as lookouts and backup in case the plan went wrong. But all four, prosecutors said, were equally invested in the outcome. Their joint purpose was clear: to eliminate Lewis Williams. Digital forensics bolstered the timeline. Phone records placed them together before and after the shooting. Social media messages, recovered even after attempts to delete, showed animosity, boasting, and premeditation. In one, sent days before the murder, meanly referenced sorting the Lewis thing. In another, Parks talked about rolling out soon. Meanly's defense argued that he didn't know the gun would discharge live ammunition. He claimed he intended to intimidate, not kill. But prosecutors dismantled the claim, pointing to the reality: this was a weapon built to kill, not scare. Jurors heard that even holding such a device in public was a calculated risk. Firing it was something else entirely. Parks's legal team tried to argue his role had been minimal. He'd driven the car, they admitted, but claimed he had no idea the others were armed. But again, the digital footprint told a different story. He'd been involved in discussions, planning, and the getaway. His hand was firmly on the wheel, in every sense. Anderton and Nika, though younger, were not treated as bystanders. Evidence showed they were present, active, and complicit. They had watched Lewis die. They had helped destroy evidence. Their silence in the days that followed, combined with their swift flight and attempts to cover tracks, spoke volumes. After weeks of testimony, on October 15, 2021, the jury delivered its verdicts. Meanly and Parks were found guilty of murder. Anderton and Nika were found guilty of manslaughter. All four were convicted of possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life. Justice, at least in part, had been delivered. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. 2 weeks after the guilty verdicts were returned, the sentencing hearing was held at Sheffield Crown Court. The atmosphere was tense. In the public gallery, Lewis Williams's family waited for the final chapter in a case that had already torn through their lives. They listened in silence as each of the defendants was called forward, the weight of justice looming large. Judge Roger Thomas KC delivered his remarks with grave clarity. He began by addressing Taylor Meanly, the teenager who had pulled the trigger. Though just 17 at the time of the murder, the judge made it clear that his youth did not absolve him of responsibility. Meanly had taken part in a deliberate, planned ambush. He had fired a homemade firearm at close range, fully aware of its power. The court heard that Lewis had no chance to react. For this, Meanly was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 27 years before being eligible for parole. Jack Parks, the man who had driven the group and helped orchestrate the attack, received the same sentence. Life imprisonment with a minimum term of 27 years. The judge noted that while he hadn't fired the weapon, his role was integral. He had guided the car through Doncaster's streets, turned it around for the second pass, and facilitated both the approach and escape. His actions, the court found, showed a complete disregard for human life. Joe Anderton, 18 at the time, was found guilty of manslaughter. The judge recognized that while he hadn't fired the shot, his involvement was still significant. He had supported the plan, traveled in the car, and made no move to intervene or warn the victim. For his part in the killing and the possession of the firearm, Anderton was sentenced to 12 years in detention. Arlind Naika, The youngest of the group, at just 16, received the same sentence. 12 years. The judge acknowledged his age, but highlighted the calculated nature of his actions. Nika had played a supportive role throughout, and like Anderton, had taken no steps to prevent what unfolded. In total, the 4 defendants received 78 years of custodial sentences. For Lewis's family, the punishment brought a measure of accountability, but no relief. In a statement read outside court, his mother described Lewis as a kind, loyal, and loving son who had been taken too soon by senseless violence. She spoke of a hole left in their lives that no amount of time or punishment could fill. And from the perspective of many, particularly those a little older, watching this unfold feels like something far worse than just another gang case. It's not just about young people making mistakes. It's about a complete breakdown in values where violence and revenge have replaced reason and responsibility. The life sentences handed to Meanley and Parks felt necessary. Deliberate, planned murder in broad daylight can't be brushed off, no matter how young the offenders are. And while the 12-year terms for Anderton and Nika may seem lighter, they reflect the legal difference between murder and manslaughter, something the system is bound to respect. Still, it's hard not to wonder, where were the influences that should have stopped this before it ever happened? Schools, families, local authorities, somewhere along the way, these boys were let down. But once you're driving around with a homemade gun, looking to end someone's life, society has little choice but to lock the door.
Police! Police! Police!
It's 8 minutes past 8, so I'm arresting you on suspicion of being concerned to supply Class A drugs.
He called himself Kilo Chris, a name that said everything about what he did and how much of it. But Christopher Barbosa wasn't your typical street dealer. Operating from Bristol, he became one of the most significant suppliers of cocaine in the southwest of England, quietly moving tens of kilos of Class A drugs while keeping his own name out of the headlines. He didn't carry drugs, he didn't hand them off in car parks, he left that to others. Barbosa ran the show from the shadows, using encrypted phones, trusted couriers, and layers of distance to protect himself. But when the network cracked, it cracked wide open. Barbosa was exposed as a key associate of Roma Hyman, a ruthless drugs boss already serving 26 years. Between them, they supplied over £3 million worth of cocaine, flooding towns across the West Country with product. And when the arrests began, Barbosa did what many at his level tried to do. He ran. Through Europe, via Dubai, across borders. But it wasn't enough. This is the story of a man who built his empire quietly, vanished loudly, and was brought down by relentless police work, encrypted evidence, and a very long memory. Before the encrypted phones and the international manhunt, Christopher Barbosa was just another name moving through Bristol's criminal world. He didn't draw attention to himself. No flashy lifestyle, no wild spending. That wasn't his way. He preferred to keep quiet, operating under the radar while making serious moves behind closed doors. Barbosa wasn't interested in street-level dealing. He stayed out of the direct transactions, choosing instead to manage logistics and relationships. His job was to build the network, not to be seen in it. That approach made him valuable. It also made him hard to trace. His biggest step up came when he connected with Roma Hyman, one of the most established cocaine traffickers in the southwest. Hyman already had strong links to supply routes in London and the Midlands, and was moving large volumes of Class A drugs across the region. Barbosa became one of his key buyers. From that point, his access to product, cash, and contacts grew fast. In just a couple of months, Barbosa arranged purchases of over 40 kilos of cocaine from Hyman. That alone put him in a different league. But he didn't stop there. He worked with other suppliers too, people already under investigation for major drug conspiracies. The Allison brothers in Wiltshire were one example. Alex Mail, another dealer operating out of Somerset, was also part of the web. All of them were connected through encrypted devices, kept distant from the actual supply chain by layers of intermediaries. Barbosa's name rarely came up during local arrests. That was by design. He didn't want to be linked directly to the drugs or the deals. Instead, he used couriers and stash houses to move the product. He relied on people like Robert Dent and James Helly to handle the risky parts: transport, storage, distribution. Dent let Barbosa use his home as a base of operations. Helly moved drugs and cash across the southwest. Both men would later be convicted and jailed. But at the time, they kept Barbosa protected. The use of encrypted technology was key. Barbosa operated through EncroChat using the handle KiloChris. It was a system that allowed him to communicate with dealers, buyers, and suppliers without fear of being tracked. For a while, it worked. EncroChat gave him the freedom to manage a wide-reaching operation without leaving much of a footprint. But things were already changing. Law enforcement had launched Operation Venetic, a coordinated move to crack encrypted communications and map out drug networks across the UK. Slowly, pieces of Barbosa's world started to surface. Messages, names, drop locations. His alias was no longer just a screen name, it was evidence. Still, Barbosa didn't panic straight away. He kept his head down, continued buying, and moved money through different channels. His confidence came from how far removed he felt from the chaos on the street. He thought that staying invisible was enough. It wasn't. His digital trail was growing, so were the arrests around him. And when the knock finally came, Barbosa made a choice. He vanished. By the time investigators fully realized what Christopher Barbosa had built, the scale of it was hard to ignore. This wasn't someone playing middleman for a few scattered deals. He'd created a network that fed cocaine into communities across the southwest with quiet consistency. It wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic, it was steady. And that's what made it effective. Everything Barbosa did relied on separation. He avoided touching the product, he avoided being seen with those doing the groundwork. But at the center of it all, he made the calls that set things in motion. Through encrypted chats, he negotiated prices, arranged drop-offs, and scheduled payments. He was the link between suppliers like Roma Hyman and the dealers putting wraps on the street. The numbers told the story. Over 66 kilos of cocaine were linked to him directly. Police believed the real figure was likely higher. Some shipments were moved in bulk, hidden inside vehicles or passed through trusted runners. Others were broken down and distributed in smaller amounts to maintain flexibility. The goal was always the same: get the drugs in, get the money out. Barbosa operated through layers. On one end were the high-level suppliers, men like Hyman and the Allison brothers, who provided wholesale quantities. On the other were regional couriers and distributors, people Barbosa barely interacted with face-to-face. That distance made it difficult to build a case against him at first. His name wasn't on the packaging, his fingerprints weren't on the cash, but the decisions ran through him. He paid people to take the risks. James Helly transported drugs between safe houses, making drop-offs along mapped routes. Robert Dent's house functioned as a base, a quiet location where product was stored and repackaged before being sent out. Both men took the weight when things started falling apart. But Barbosa kept operating in the background, coordinating from wherever he was. What made the network dangerous wasn't just the amount of drugs being moved, it was how normalized it had become. Deliveries were made like clockwork, payments flowed back to the top with few disruptions. Addicts in towns like Weston-super-Mare, Swindon and Bath were being served by a system that worked more like a business than a gang. While others in the trade relied on fear or reputation, Barbosa relied on control. He knew who to trust. He knew which routes were safest. And he didn't make the same mistakes as others who flaunted their success or posted cryptic messages online. His style was measured, and for a long time, it kept him safe. But the encrypted messages, what he thought were his greatest shield, became the weak point. Operation Venetic began to unravel the web, and Barbosa's handle, Kilo Chris, was no longer anonymous. Police traced deals, drop-offs, and shipments back to his encrypted conversations. Bit by bit, they rebuilt the timeline. Behind the numbers were communities facing the consequences. The drugs Barbosa helped move didn't just end up in dealers' hands. They hit families, schools, and estates already struggling. He may have avoided the street, but the harm passed through him all the same. And as the walls started to close in, He didn't stay to fight it. He made another choice. He disappeared. When Operation Venetic exposed the EncroChat network in 2020, dealers across the UK felt the pressure. Arrests were happening fast. Phones were being decrypted. Barbosa knew what was coming, and unlike many of his associates, he didn't wait to be arrested. He left the country before the full case could land on him. The timing was deliberate. He slipped out before charges were formally filed, moving across borders before warrants could catch up. This wasn't panic. It was preparation. He knew how the system worked, and he used that knowledge to stay ahead of it. His route took him through mainland Europe. Reports suggest he travelled through Spain, Belgium and Germany, avoiding airports where identification checks were tighter. Instead, he used ground transport and temporary accommodations. Fake documents, burner phones and support from criminal contacts helped him stay low. For over a year, he managed to stay just out of reach. But even with planning, Barbosa made a mistake. On his way from Dubai to Barcelona, he passed through Paris. That was where French authorities caught up with him, acting on intelligence shared by the Southwest Regional Organised Crime Unit and the National Crime Agency. He was arrested before boarding his next flight, and just like that, the chase was over. His time in custody wasn't straightforward. Barbosa contested extradition at every turn. Legal challenges, paperwork delays and appeals stretched the process across more than 12 months. But eventually, the decisions went against him. In December 2023, he was flown back to the UK under police escort. By the time he landed, everything had changed. His safe houses had been searched. His couriers had been sentenced. His suppliers, Hyman, Mail, the Allisons, were already serving long jail terms. Barbosa returned to face a case that had been built layer by layer, strengthened by the very technology he had once relied on to stay hidden. Authorities described him as a major player who thought he could outweight the law, but international cooperation made that impossible. His arrest in Paris and return to the UK marked the final chapter in a manhunt that stretched across continents. For detectives, his capture wasn't just about one man. It sent a wider message that high-level criminals, even those who hide behind tech and distance, can still be tracked. That the days of disappearing into another country and hoping the trail goes cold are no longer reliable. And for Barbosa, the run had ended. His freedom was gone. The evidence was stacked, and the courtroom was waiting. When Christopher Barbosa stepped into the courtroom at Bristol Crown Court in early 2025, he wasn't a mystery anymore. His alias, Kylo Creer, had been decoded. His network had collapsed, and the prosecution had built a solid case that linked him to over 66 kilos of cocaine moved across the southwest. What the jury saw wasn't a man caught on the edge of a criminal world. They were shown evidence of someone deeply embedded in it, someone who had used encrypted phones, trusted lieutenants, and a constant layer of separation to keep himself protected. But that distance no longer mattered. The decrypted EncroChat messages removed all doubt. Barbosa had been directing orders, arranging bulk deals, and tracking payments in real time. Prosecutors leaned heavily on those messages. They highlighted how Barbosa communicated with major suppliers like Roma Hyman, whose own case had already been tried. Messages showed discussions about delivery times, quantities, and cash handovers. The scale of the orders, sometimes multiple kilos at once, was impossible to dismiss as low-level dealing. Barbosa was buying product worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. And it wasn't one-off business. It was routine. The Crown also brought forward evidence from Barbosa's inner circle. Couriers like James Helly and Robert Dent had already been jailed. Their convictions supported the prosecution's narrative. Barbosa was the organizer, the coordinator. He didn't touch the drugs, but he controlled the flow. Dent's house had been used as a safe location. Helly had moved large sums of cash and product, and both had done so under Barbosa's instructions. His defense tried to argue he was no longer active when the EncroChat network fell apart. They claimed he had stepped away, distancing himself from crime. But the timeline didn't support it. Barbosa had continued communicating with contacts even after initial arrests. He was still part of the system, still involved in planning, moving, and profiting. One of the more powerful moments in court came when the prosecution detailed how Barbosa had tried to disappear. They framed his escape through Europe not as fear, but as strategy. It wasn't just about avoiding prison, it was about protecting himself, his assets, and his control. The jury heard all of it: the texts, the scale, the method, and the flight. They saw a man who had built a criminal business with corporate precision, but without any of the oversight or accountability that comes with a legitimate trade. When the verdict came, it was clear: guilty of conspiracy to supply Class A drugs, the encrypted chats, the supplier network, the weight of product moved. None of it could be explained away. Barbosa didn't show much emotion, but the message from the courtroom was loud enough. No more aliases, no more distance. Just the reality of what he'd built and what it had cost. On April 4th, 2025, at Bristol Crown Court, Christopher Barbosa, known to his network as Kylo Chris, was sentenced to 19 years in prison. The judge described him as a central figure in a sophisticated drug supply chain. Not someone pulled into the lifestyle, not someone operating under pressure, but a man who had chosen his place at the top. Barbosa had coordinated the purchase and movement of over 66 kilos of cocaine. He used encrypted tech to manage his orders, sourced kilos at a time, and outsourced the risk to others. It was a business model, one based on exploitation and distance. The court acknowledged his influence in the southwest drug scene. His reach stretched across counties. His name was linked to multiple suppliers, chiefly Roma Hyman, who had already been sentenced to 26 years, and Alex Mail, who received 18. Barbosa had purchased 46 kilos of cocaine from Hyman alone in just 2 months, and sourced even more from the Allison brothers and Mail. He didn't just connect the dots, he was the one drawing the map. Prosecutors outlined how Barbosa had used couriers like James Helly and Robert Dent, both already behind bars for their roles. Dent's house had functioned as a safe house. Helly handled transport. Barbosa, meanwhile, kept his name clean, at least on paper. But the decrypted messages from EncroChat, the ones uncovered during Operation Venetic, removed all ambiguity. The handle Kilo Chris wasn't just a name, it was a role, and the evidence spoke for itself. Barbosa's defense tried to soften the sentence. They pointed to his time in custody in France, his lack of direct involvement in physical dealing, and argued that he was no longer active when the network began to fall. But the judge saw it differently. The flight, the hidden communications, and the continued connections with major dealers painted the opposite picture. So the court handed down a sentence that reflected the scale of harm. 19 years. The reaction was mixed. On one hand, this was a victory for law enforcement, a clear example of what happens when encrypted tech is broken and organized crime is exposed. The Southwest Regional Organized Crime Unit had removed yet another key figure in a sprawling web of supply lines, couriers, and cash. Communities across the Southwest saw it as a long-awaited win. But here's where the conversation shifts. 19 years sounds like justice. But for someone who moved over £3 million worth of Class A drugs, who used people as shields while keeping his hands clean, it also sounds like a bargain. Barbosa wasn't a street dealer scraping by. He was a silent strategist at the top of a violent trade, one that ruins lives, fuels addiction, and drives youth exploitation. And yet, for all that, he'll be eligible for release in under 2 decades. What's worse is what this sentence might signal to others in the game. That if you're smart enough, detached enough, and don't get caught with product in your hand, you might just ride it out. That you can build an empire from the shadows and walk away with your life intact. There's no doubt the system worked in catching him. But is it keeping up with the scale of harm these men are causing? Or is it sending the message that even the masterminds still have a way out? Because in the world Barbosa came from, 19 years might feel less like punishment, and more like the cost of doing business.
In towns like Swindon and Trowbridge, it looked like life was normal. But behind closed doors, a major drug gang was running one of the biggest cocaine operations the Southwest had ever seen. From 2016 to 2020, more than 70 kilograms of cocaine were moved through Wiltshire, hidden in cars delivered by couriers and organised through secret phone messages. The men behind it were two brothers, Warren and Kelroy Allison. They didn't stand on street corners. They planned everything from a distance, using trusted drivers and encrypted phones. Others took the risk. They made the money. Warren showed off his wealth with sports cars and designer clothes. But most people had no idea where it came from. In fact, the gang had made itself part of everyday life, using homes, roads, and people who blended into the background. It was only when neighbours started to notice things that didn't add up, and police began to watch closely, that the truth started to come out. That's when Operation Yelm began. When officers finally made their move, they uncovered something far bigger than they expected. This wasn't just a local drug crew. It was a full-scale network, hidden in plain sight. Warren Allison wasn't a man who hid in the shadows. He lived loud, behind the wheel of a Lamborghini Huracan, a Mercedes C 63 AMG, or an Audi RS6, tearing through Wiltshire like a man untouchable. His wealth was impossible to ignore, and that was the point. It was a carefully curated image. Power, success, status. But behind the revving engines and designer labels lay something far more calculated. Warren wasn't just flaunting money, he was laundering power. He had built, alongside his older brother Kelroy, a criminal operation that spanned multiple counties and pushed tens of millions of pounds worth of cocaine into the southwest over nearly 5 years. Based in Swindon and Trowbridge, the Allison brothers didn't deal in street-level chaos. They operated like CEOs. Their structure was tight, their communication encrypted, and their movements measured. Using EncroChat and Sky ECC, they negotiated with Albanian suppliers, organized logistics, and delegated operations without ever needing to touch the product themselves. The cocaine was bought in bulk, broken down into distributable quantities, and passed into the hands of trusted couriers, drivers, and mid-level distributors. It was an industrial operation running with terrifying efficiency beneath the surface of small-town Britain. Their model was smart and, above all, scalable. Warren and Kelroy treated drug trafficking like a franchise, plugging in new personnel as others dropped out, constantly moving parts around the board to avoid suspicion. They exploited not just systems, but people, using relationships, debts, and desperation to secure loyalty. The brothers weren't known for violence, but for control. Control through money, through access, through the illusion of success. From the outside, it looked like a pair of self-made men living a dream life. But beneath the gloss was a ruthless system built on secrecy, exploitation, and calculated distance. The Allisons didn't just run a drug business, they engineered a machine. And for nearly half a decade, that machine operated in plain sight, shielded by arrogance, encrypted signals, and the belief that they were simply too sophisticated to fall. Beneath the polished exterior of the Allison operation was a tightly coordinated network. Each individual selected not just for their usefulness, but for how easily they could be replaced. This wasn't a crew of street corner dealers. It was a fluid, carefully managed hierarchy where everyone had a role and no one was indispensable. At the core was Richard Cowell, a 57-year-old from Swindon who became the gang's most trusted courier. His job was to transport vast amounts of cocaine and cash across the region, often without drawing the slightest attention. To do it, he used a specially modified vehicle fitted with hidden compartments. Purpose-built to avoid detection during stop-and-search scenarios, he communicated via EncroChat using the handle South Kangaroo, and during trial admitted to working not only for the Allisons but also for other organised crime groups. He was the quiet engine of the operation, crossing counties with a smile and a boot full of secrets. Then there was Portia Densley. She wasn't just Warren Allison's girlfriend, she was the network's financial brain. From her base in Melksham, Densley managed the cash flow that kept the business alive. She collected and delivered thousands in drug money, transferred funds on Warren's instructions, and ensured that the operation's most volatile component, money, never became a liability. Without her, the system would have stalled. Further down the chain, the operation relied on family loyalty. Warren's cousin, Anthony Burke, acted as a local receiver in Bristol. In November 2020, during a targeted raid, police stormed his flat and discovered 4 kilograms of cocaine hidden in a seemingly innocent supermarket bag for life. The drop, worth up to £400,000, tied Burke directly to the inner workings of the network. But the real power came from above. Albanian nationals Lidian Hoxha and Peter Pisha supplied the cocaine, large wholesale quantities that were delivered with quiet precision. They weren't just partners, they were the gatekeepers of the product. Enid Aliko, another critical figure, provided encrypted SKY-ECC devices and acted as a bridge between the Allisons and their international suppliers. Together, this group formed a pipeline that spanned borders, blended into communities and moved millions, one compartment, one transfer, one message at a time. Like most modern organized crime groups, the Allison network didn't rely on whispers in alleyways or burner phones passed between hands. Their operation thrived on encrypted technology, specifically the use of EncroChat and later Sky ECC. These platforms promised criminals what they craved most: invisibility. Through a veil of digital security, they could plan shipments, issue commands, and handle disputes, all without fear of interception. Handles like South Kangaroo and Legal Master became pseudonyms in a parallel criminal world, where real names were replaced by usernames and messages vanished in seconds. For a time, the system worked flawlessly. The encrypted phones, often sold as untraceable and military-grade, gave the Allisons confidence that they were operating beyond the reach of law enforcement. But that illusion shattered in June 2020. In a landmark international operation, French law enforcement breached EncroChat, accessing a vast reservoir of covert messages. Across Europe, panic set in. Encrypted phones, once a shield, had become a liability. The Allison brothers were suddenly vulnerable. Messages once thought secure could now be scrutinized, mapped, and attributed. And, unbeknownst to them, Wiltshire Police's Serious Organised Crime Unit, SOCIU, had already been watching. With support from the National Crime Agency, investigators began analysing the trove of intercepted data. Thousands of chat logs, voice notes, and location pings were painstakingly reviewed. Patterns began to emerge: routes, dates, key contacts. Encrypted anonymity had given the gang's scale. But it had also left a digital footprint, one that, when decrypted, revealed the true scope of the operation. What the Allisons had considered untouchable technology was now the very thing that would help dismantle their empire, message by message, line by line, line by... There wasn't a single dramatic moment when the empire collapsed. No helicopters overhead, no doors kicked in under cover of darkness. Instead, it was slow, strategic, relentless. A careful web of surveillance, data gathering, and silent observation that slowly began to tighten. Officers from Wiltshire Police's Serious Organised Crime Unit tracked the comings and goings of vehicles, monitored known addresses, and kept eyes on suspected couriers. They watched where money moved, who met who, and when. What tipped the scales was visibility. Warren Allison's obsession with high-performance cars didn't just feed his ego, it raised eyebrows. Lamborghinis don't go unnoticed in market towns, neither do men with no obvious income flaunting wealth on public roads. Community intelligence started to drip in. People spoke up. Police listened. The investigation moved into its final phase. On 3rd November 2020, a critical delivery was intercepted. Surveillance teams observed 4 kilograms of cocaine being handed off to Anthony Burke, at an address in Ronayne Walk, Bristol. Officers waited until the handover was complete, then moved in. Burke was arrested at the scene. Inside his flat, police found the cocaine hidden inside a supermarket bag for life. Just another quiet drop in a far louder operation. The floodgates opened. Coordinated raids followed across Wiltshire and Bristol. Digital devices were seized, ledgers recovered. Hidden compartments were uncovered in vehicles and homes. Evidence dated back to 2016. Years of messages, transactions, and transport schedules preserved in digital silence. Some, like Albanian nationals Lidian Hoxha and Pieter Pisha, attempted to flee the UK. They didn't get far. Extradition orders brought them back. Others stayed behind, believing vague stories about counterfeit clothing might hold up under pressure. But the police weren't buying it, and neither would the jury. Winchester Crown Court became the battleground where years of covert investigation met cold, forensic justice. The case against Warren and Kelroy Allison, along with 6 of their associates, unfolded over 12 painstaking weeks, each day peeling back another layer of the criminal enterprise that had for almost 5 years quietly flooded the southwest with cocaine. Prosecutors outlined a business model that was as calculated as it was corrupt. More than 70 kilograms of high-grade Class A drugs had been shipped across counties, managed via encrypted communications, and couriered in vehicles specially modified to conceal their illicit cargo. At the helm of it all stood the Allison brothers, calm, composed, and utterly unrepentant. The defense, in contrast, tried to cloud the issue with a story that verged on the implausible. Warren and Kelroy Allison, along with their trusted driver Richard Cowell, claimed that the messages pulled from EncroChat and Sky ECC platforms weren't related to drugs at all. Instead, they insisted the talk of deliveries, weights, and drops referred to counterfeit clothing. According to them, the entire conspiracy amounted to nothing more than a bootleg fashion business. But the jury wasn't buying it. The prosecution presented damning evidence. Surveillance footage capturing a major cocaine delivery in Bristol, drug ledgers recovered from Kelroy's mobile phone dating back to 2016, and financial records that showed money being funneled across various accounts under Portia Densley's control. Her role as Warren's romantic partner didn't shield her. Instead, it positioned her at the very heart of the financial arm of the operation. She had moved tens of thousands in cash, handled collections from couriers, and helped launder the proceeds of crime, all while maintaining the illusion of an ordinary life in Melksham. Then came the Albanian connection. Prosecutors detailed how Lidian Hoxha and Pieter Pisha had supplied bulk quantities of cocaine to the Allisons, using encrypted phones and coded exchanges. When police swooped on a delivery to Anthony Burke, Warren's cousin, in Bristol, they seized 4 kilograms of cocaine concealed inside a supermarket bag for life. Hoxha and Pisha fled the country in the aftermath, but they were tracked down, arrested, and ultimately returned to face justice. Another associate, Enid Aliko, acted as a crucial go-between, providing encrypted SKY ECC devices and facilitating communication between the Wiltshire group and their Albanian suppliers. Piece by piece, the Crown's case dismantled the defence's claims. This was not counterfeit clothing. This was cocaine, processed, packaged, and delivered with clinical efficiency. The jury saw it for what it was: an elaborate, well-oiled network that profited off addiction, fear, and silence. The denials, the designer alibis, the whispered insistence that it was just clothes, they all collapsed under the weight of hard evidence and relentless prosecution. On 6 February 2025, sentencing was delivered. Warren Allison, the operation's undisputed leader, received 23 years in prison for 2 counts of conspiracy to supply cocaine. His brother Kelroy was sentenced to 16.5 years. Richard Cowell, the 57-year-old courier, who admitted to working for multiple crime groups, was jailed for 9 years. Portia Densley, finance manager, enabler and fixer, was handed an 8-year term. Anthony Burke, caught red-handed with £400,000 worth of cocaine, received 8 years as well. On the supplier side, Lydian Hoxha was sentenced to 7 years and 4 months. Gita Pisha received 6 years and 8 months. And Enid Aliko, whose encrypted comms helped hold the chain together after others had scattered, was jailed for 4 years. In total, the 8 defendants received a combined 82 years behind bars, a sentence that matched not only the scale of the criminal operation, but the social cost it had inflicted across communities. The collapse of the Allison network wasn't just the end of one criminal enterprise. It was the beginning of a far wider reckoning. Operation Yelm started as a local investigation triggered by whispers, surveillance, and community suspicion. But as the evidence stacked up, it became clear that this was no isolated ring. This was a gateway, one that led to broader networks operating both nationally and internationally. The intelligence gathered during the takedown didn't just lock up 8 people. It exposed relationships, routes, and routines that helped authorities disrupt other serious organized crime groups across the UK. Some of those groups were directly linked to the Allisons. Others were connected through shared suppliers, encrypted communication hubs, or common laundering routes. The encrypted devices seized during the operation revealed conversations that reached far beyond Wiltshire, tying small-town Britain to major trafficking corridors running through Europe. What started in Swindon and Trowbridge became part of a larger crackdown on the encrypted underworld, where drugs, weapons and money move with terrifying efficiency, hidden behind technology and silence. But while the law enforcement victory was significant, the local impact was equally profound. For years, these communities had unknowingly hosted key parts of a sprawling drug empire. Safe houses, handover spots, laundering fronts, they were hidden in plain sight. The operation revealed a sobering truth. Organized crime doesn't need violence to thrive. It just needs quiet. It needs routine. It needs people to look the other way. And that's what made Wiltshire so attractive. It wasn't the obvious place to build a drug empire. That was the genius of it. Low visibility, high trust. A place where flashy cars could turn heads, but not necessarily raise alarms. Until they did. In the aftermath, Wiltshire Police and the National Crime Agency urged communities to stay vigilant. Unexplained wealth, shifts in behavior, unusual movements at odd hours. These are the signs that, while subtle, can unravel something much bigger. Because if it happened here, on these roads, in these towns, it can happen anywhere. The takedown of the Allisons wasn't just a disruption, it was a revelation. And while the phones are now silent and the network dismantled, the message is loud and clear. Serious organized crime doesn't need permission to move in. It only needs time. It was just after 11 p.m. in the quiet East London suburb of Woodford Green, when 6 shots shattered the night. A man stood in his kitchen, unaware he was being watched from the darkness of his back garden. Moments later, 2 bullets tore through the glass, striking him in the neck and hand. The victim? Paul Allen, once a feared cage fighter, and more infamously, the right-hand man in Britain's biggest cash robbery. Now, bleeding out on the kitchen floor of a luxury home, Allen's past had come back with lethal intent. But this wasn't a random attack. It was the climax of a carefully orchestrated plan, involving surveillance, tracking devices, international burglaries, and a murder plot that spanned 2 countries. The men behind it? 3 seasoned criminals with a taste for high-stakes jobs and a determination to settle old scores. Their mission nearly succeeded. But in the years that followed, detectives would pick apart every move, every message, every mile driven. and what they uncovered was something far darker than a revenge hit. This is the story of how Daniel Kelly and the Ahern brothers almost pulled off the perfect execution and how they lost everything in the process. To understand the motive behind the shooting, you first have to understand the man at the center of it all, Paul Allen. He wasn't just a name in the criminal underworld, he was a legend. In 2006, Allen played a central role in what remains Britain's largest cash robbery, the Securitas Depot heist in Tonbridge, Kent. The plan was cinematic in scale: armed men in masks, a manager's family kidnapped and held hostage, staff tied up at gunpoint, and over £54 million in cash packed into a 7-ton lorry and driven away under the cover of night. It was bold, violent, flawless, almost. The authorities caught up with Allen, and in 2009, he was sentenced to 18 years. But the money? Most of it was never recovered, and neither were the grudges. By 2019, Allen was a free man. He'd traded the shadows of the criminal world for a quieter life, or so it seemed. Now in his 40s, he was living with his partner and children in a luxury rented home in Woodford Green, East London. It was the kind of place that suggested new beginnings. Detached, respectable, tucked away from his past, but the past has a way of catching up. Allen had been the trusted lieutenant of Lee Lightning Murray, the infamous cage fighter turned mastermind of the Securitas job. Both were known for precision, for ruthlessness, and for a certain code among thieves. Yet in a world where loyalties are as fragile as freedom, it didn't take much to turn old alliances into targets. And that's what Allen had become, a target. Whether it was revenge, unfinished business, or an attempt to silence a man who knew too much, someone had decided his time was up. But this wouldn't be a street corner hit or a pub brawl. What was coming for Paul Allen had been planned, tracked, scoped. And when the bullets came through his kitchen window, they weren't just aimed at his body, they were aimed at everything he once represented. The men who came for Paul Allen weren't reckless or impulsive. They were cold, disciplined, and deeply embedded in organised crime. Daniel Kelly was a career criminal known for his reach beyond UK borders. Stuart and Louis Ahern, brothers from southeast London, had long been operating in the shadows. They didn't make moves without planning them first, and when they did, the stakes were usually high. Weeks before the shooting, the trio had already proven what they were capable of. In Switzerland, they orchestrated a high-value museum burglary that saw rare Ming Dynasty antiques disappear overnight. The execution was slick, the getaway clean, and the artifacts, worth millions, briefly vanished into the criminal underworld. Kelly and Louis even flew to Asia, trying to sell one of the stolen pieces through a legitimate auction house. It wasn't just about money, it was about reach, boldness, and believing they were untouchable. But by July 2019, their attention had shifted dramatically and violently back home. Paul Allen was now in their sights. The motive behind the hit remains murky. Was it personal? A score to settle from their shared past in the criminal world? Or was Allen, recently out of prison, seen as a threat, someone who knew too much or had talked to the wrong people? What's clear is how calculated the lead-up was. The men planted a GPS tracker on Allen's car, a black Mercedes, and synced it to an iPad. They didn't guess his movements, they studied them. Every trip, every stop, every return home was logged. When he was inside, when he was alone, how long he stayed out, all of it monitored in real time. That same iPad, later found at the bottom of the Thames, would become a silent witness in court, a digital roadmap to a planned assassination. This wasn't rage, it wasn't random, it was targeted. And what had started with stolen art and bold escapes was about to escalate into something far more permanent: murder. By the evening of July 11th, 2019, the plan was in motion. The Renault Captur, a seemingly ordinary hire car, had been secured 2 days earlier by Stuart Ahern. But this wasn't its first outing. Just the night before, it had been used in a burglary at a gated community in Sevenoaks, Kent. The gang had posed as police officers, fitted the vehicle with a blue flashing light, and broken into a luxury flat. Handbags, designer clothes, and cash were taken. Now, with the same car and a new target, their intentions were far more violent. That night, the trio left their home turf in Woolwich, southeast London, and crossed the city under the cover of darkness. Their route took them through the Blackwall Tunnel, cutting north towards Woodford Green. It was a calculated journey, one they'd made before during their surveillance runs. They knew exactly where to go. Stuart Ahern parked the car on Worcester Avenue, just behind the target's home. While he stayed behind the wheel, acting as lookout and getaway driver, Daniel Kelly and Louis Ahern slipped through a neighbouring garden. From this vantage point, they had a clear view of Paul Allen's back garden and, crucially, his kitchen. Just after 11:09 p.m, the silence shattered. 6 rounds were fired through the glass doors and windows, the sudden cracks tearing through the night like thunder. Allen had been standing in the kitchen. One bullet hit his hand, another tore into his neck and lodged near his spinal cord. He collapsed on the floor as his partner, Jade Bovington, screamed for help. Within seconds, Kelly and Lewis were gone, back through the garden, into the waiting car, and away into the darkness. Allen's life hung in the balance. Paramedics and police arrived within minutes. He was rushed into emergency surgery, where doctors managed to save his life. But the damage was irreversible. The bullet that struck his neck had severed his spinal cord. The once feared cage fighter, who'd helped pull off the biggest cash robbery in British history, was now paralyzed from the chest down. The gunman hadn't finished the job, but they'd changed a life forever. In the aftermath of the shooting, the scene was chaotic, but detectives knew time was critical. The Metropolitan Police cordoned off Malvern Drive and began their work. Forensics combed through the garden, the house, and the surrounding properties. Within hours, crucial clues began to emerge. 5 bullet casings were found, scattered near a summer house at the rear of the garden. Ballistics confirmed they came from a Glock SLP handgun, a model often favoured in organised crime due to its compact design and stopping power. Inside the house, another bullet had lodged in a doorframe, missing Allen by inches, but it was the swabs taken from a nearby fence panel that delivered the first major breakthrough. DNA recovered from that fence, just yards from the firing position, provided a match to both Daniel Kelly and Louis Ahern. A second major lead came when officers searched Kelly's address. Hidden among his belongings was a laser sight compatible with the Glock model used in the attack, an accessory often used to enhance accuracy in low light. It was damning. Meanwhile, investigators followed the trail of the hire car. CCTV and ANPR footage captured the Renault Captur travelling from Woolwich to Woodford Green and back again. The vehicle had been hired 2 days before the shooting by Stuart Ahern. When police finally recovered it, Kelly's fingerprints were found on the dashboard and passenger side door, but perhaps the most telling piece of evidence came later. In 2024, nearly 5 years after the attack, officers retrieved an iPad from the River Thames near the O2 Arena. Forensics experts managed to extract fragments of location data, even after it had been wiped. It had been used to track Paul Allen's Mercedes in the days leading up to the shooting. The digital trail was complete. Every breadcrumb led back to the same 3 men. While the attempted murder in Woodford Green dominated headlines in the UK, it was far from the only serious crime the trio had on their record. Just weeks before the shooting of Paul Allen, Daniel Kelly and the Ahern brothers were already on the radar of Swiss authorities for a separate high-value burglary. one that bore all the hallmarks of a professional, premeditated job. On the night of June 1st, 2019, the trio broke into the Museum of Far Eastern Arts in Geneva. Their entry was methodical. Wearing gloves, masks, and forehead lamps, they used an angle grinder, crowbar, and sledgehammer to force open the museum's doors. Once inside, they headed straight for a display labelled Room 3, home to some of the museum's most valuable artefacts. In under 5 minutes, they had smashed open display case 13 and escaped with 3 rare Ming Dynasty porcelain pieces: a delicate phoenix design bowl from the 14th century, a tiny chicken cup from the 15th, and a pomegranate decorated bottle valued at nearly £2 million alone. In total, the haul was worth over £2.7 million, and just like that, they vanished. 2 weeks later, the group flew to Hong Kong in an attempt to sell the Phoenix Bowl at an auction house. But it was back in London where their plan began to unravel. In October 2020, Stuart Ahern was arrested during a sting operation at a central London hotel where he was trying to sell the stolen vase to an undercover police officer posing as a buyer. A subsequent search uncovered a fake passport in Stuart's name and a book on Ming Dynasty antiques, further tying them to the Geneva burglary. The Aherns were extradited to Switzerland, convicted of aggravated theft, and later returned to the UK to face far graver charges. By March 2025, nearly 6 years after Paul Allen was gunned down in his own kitchen, the full weight of the case was laid bare before a jury at the Old Bailey. It had taken years of forensic work, international cooperation, and painstaking investigation to reach this point. Now, the evidence, collected from gardens, devices, vehicles, and even riverbeds, was presented in sharp detail. Prosecutors wasted no time in dismantling the defendant's narrative. They walked the court through the planning stages: the tracking device planted on Allen's car, the hire car used for surveillance, the DNA found on a garden fence, the Glock handgun's spent casings, and the laser sight recovered from Kelly's home. Each thread of evidence tightened the noose. The defense tried to muddy the waters. They claimed coincidence. They questioned the reliability of the digital trail. At one point, Daniel Kelly insisted in a prepared statement that he held no grudge against Allen, claiming they'd known each other for over 2 decades and had always been on good terms. But the jury wasn't buying it. Friendship doesn't end in gunfire through a kitchen window. Paul Allen himself never took the stand. His injuries had changed his life irreversibly, but his silence didn't matter. The data, the footage, the fingerprints, those spoke louder than any testimony ever could. On 24th March 2025, the verdict was read out. All 3 men, Daniel Kelly, Stuart Ahern, and Louis Ahern, were found guilty of conspiracy to murder. As the decision was delivered, Stuart Ahern shouted at the jury, "You're only human. That's all I have to say about that." The courtroom fell silent. Justice had been delivered. But the impact of what had happened and how far the conspirators had gone would echo far beyond the verdict. This case was never just about one man being shot in his kitchen. It was about the lengths some will go to silence the past. It was about international art theft, digital surveillance, and violent retribution wrapped into a single web of criminality. The shooting exposed a layer of criminal enterprise most people associate with films, not real life. Ming Dynasty antiques, GPS trackers, hired getaway cars, gangsters posing as police officers to burgle high-end homes. And behind it all, 3 men from southeast London, each believing they were too smart to get caught. But they were wrong. Detectives didn't just respond to a shooting, they built a case that spanned years, borders, and disciplines. They worked with Swiss authorities, digital forensics teams, firearms analysts, and surveillance experts. They pulled an iPad from the bottom of a river and turned it into courtroom evidence. They found Kelly's fingerprints in a hire car returned weeks earlier, They put together a timeline so tight it left the defense with nowhere to hide. Paul Allen survived, but his life was permanently altered. The man who once helped mastermind a £54 million robbery now moves through the world in a wheelchair, his past etched into every scar. And yet, justice was served, not just for him, but for a system too often outpaced by modern crime. Daniel Kelly, Stuart Ahern, Lewis Ahern. Their days of plotting in the shadows are over. Sentencing is set for April 25th, and the only journeys they'll be taking now are between a cell and a courtroom. This wasn't just a failed hit, it was a reminder that even in a world of encrypted apps, fake passports and international escapes, someone is always watching. And if the evidence doesn't get you, the river might still give up your secrets. The moment police raid Britain's biggest county lines, drugs gangs, which made £1.2 million a year.
Police! Police, stay where you are! Stay where you are! Chill out, man. Put your hands behind your back.
In the suburbs of Birmingham and Solihull, a criminal network was quietly pulling in staggering profits. 4 drug lines, operated like mini-franchises under one umbrella, were flooding the streets with heroin and crack cocaine. They weren't hiding in the shadows, they were operating in plain sight. Phones ringing non-stop, customers queuing up, and money rolling in. At its peak, this county lines operation was making over £100,000 a month. But while they were running a business, police were building a case. And soon, this well-oiled machine would grind to a halt. Over the course of a 6-month investigation, West Midlands Police tracked every movement, intercepted calls, and eventually tore the operation apart in dramatic dawn raids. The result? 12 gang members jailed for more than 100 years combined. This is the story of Operation Huntarian, the task force that brought them down, and how 4 drug lines working together as a rare coalition tried to dominate the Midlands drug trade. In most county line setups, a single phone number is all that's needed to run a profitable drug line. But this gang took it a step further. They weren't just running one number, they were managing 4. Known as the Rico, Diego, Figo and Potter lines, each operated like its own branch of a larger organization, with different teams, separate territories and unique customer bases. But instead of clashing over control, they worked together. They shared contacts, drugs, resources, and even couriers. It wasn't just unusual, it was strategic. And it paid off massively. The lines were active across East Birmingham and Solihull. Every day, bulk messages were blasted out to hundreds of drug users, offering heroin and crack cocaine with quick delivery. Customers didn't need to know who was behind the line. They just had to call, place their order, and wait. On average, these phones received over 1,000 calls a day. At peak times, they were making between £18,000 and £20,000 a week. That's nearly £100,000 a month, tax-free and entirely illegal. Each line had its own operators and enforcers. The Rico line was run by brothers Adam and Haroon Iqbal, alongside Mohammed Usman. Operating mainly out of Hodge Hill, they kept things moving with clockwork precision, coordinating supply runs, answering calls, and ensuring their customer base stayed loyal. They were frequently found in the same location as the active Rico phone, and during police raids, multiple devices linked to the line were recovered from their homes. Then came the Diego line. At one point, it was being handled by Adam Slater and Tiana Phillips, who were both stopped in Solihull with active Diego phones in their possession. But when the heat turned up, the line was switched to a new network by Yassine Sadiq, a move designed to throw off investigators. It was a classic dealer tactic: change the SIM, ditch the old phone, stay ahead of the game. But it didn't work. Telecommunications teams tracked the activity, and CCTV footage confirmed the link between Sadiq and the line. The Figo line, meanwhile, was controlled by Ilyas Sadiq. He wasn't working alone. Mark Seeley and Amani Adams helped him manage operations, arranging drop-offs and collecting payments. Their coordination was tight, with Seeley's vehicle regularly captured outside shops, known to be top-up points for the line. Drug users would even be offered extra product for topping up credit, a tactic often used to keep the line live and customer loyalty strong. Finally, the Potter line had its own network, led by Anis Mahmoud, Humer ul Rehman, and Levi Mukwita. But Mukwita's role extended further. He was the link between all four lines, the middleman. He wasn't just operating his own stretch. He was supplying product to the entire coalition, arranging pickups and ensuring the other lines stayed stocked. He had communication with almost every member of the network, and his phone data told the full story. Together, the four lines formed one of the most lucrative and well-organized county lines networks the West Midlands had seen in years. They weren't just street dealers, they were running a criminal business empire, and for a while it seemed unstoppable. The alarm bells started ringing in late 2022. Reports of increased drug activity, more overdoses and rising street-level violence in East Birmingham and Solihull triggered a deeper look by the newly established County Lines Task Force. What started as scattered intelligence quickly began to form a pattern. 4 distinct phone lines were generating abnormal traffic, thousands of messages, late-night movement, and a surge in users that didn't match typical local supply trends. Operation Huntarian was born out of that pattern. Rather than launch an immediate takedown, investigators opted for patience. They knew the structure was bigger than it first appeared. Each burner phone was tracked, not just the number itself, but where it was switched on, who carried it, and what numbers it connected to. Every courier stop, every drug run, and every top-up was logged. Safe houses were identified through routine footfall and parked vehicles staying beyond reasonable hours. The team placed unmarked cars in high-activity zones, watching properties where strange comings and goings were clocked at all hours. They intercepted messages and traced patterns of communication between gang members. Each bit of intel brought them closer to understanding not just who was involved, but how the whole operation ticked. They discovered the lines were never dormant. Messages came through day and night, advertising fresh deals, arranging drop-offs, or fielding orders. Customers would get offers like 3 for $25 or on now, coded language that made sense only in context but had devastating impact on the streets. The lines had become part of everyday life in some communities. Addicts relying on them like food delivery services, the phones acting as a lifeline to addiction. Detectives began linking the phones to individuals. CCTV footage was matched with known dealers. Vehicle telematics helped place suspects at key addresses. Gradually, the walls began closing in. The groundwork was set, the intelligence locked in. All that was left was the strike, and when it came, it would be fast, loud, and impossible to ignore. May 2023 marked the moment West Midlands Police moved in. After half a year of patient surveillance and intelligence gathering, the green light was given. 17 warrants were executed in a single morning across Birmingham and Solihull, marking the start of one of the force's most significant county lines takedowns to date. Officers hit multiple properties at once. The operation was fast, aggressive, and thoroughly coordinated. Body-worn camera footage later released to the public showed exactly how it unfolded. Battering rams, smashing through front doors, officers flooding into living rooms, suspects pulled from mattresses before they had time to think. In some homes, windows were broken to access rooms faster. In others, suspects were cornered mid-attempt to destroy key evidence. Mobile phones, the backbone of the gang's operation, were grabbed within seconds of entry, preserving the vital digital trail investigators had spent months mapping out.
Police! Police, stay where you are! Stay where you are! Chill out, man. Put Your hands behind your back. I've got him there. I've got the mail. On the floor.
What they found inside confirmed everything the task force had suspected. Bundles of Class A drugs, concealed cash stacks, burner phones, SIM cards, even handwritten customer lists. Hidden compartments revealed drug stashes. Walls had been drilled into. Drawers had false bottoms. These weren't careless dealers. They were professionals, and they'd prepped for this moment, but not well enough. The arrests began immediately. Adam and Harun Iqbal were detained along with Mohammed Usman, all central to the RICO line. Adam Slater and Tiana Phillips were taken with Diego line phones still live. Mark Seeley's vehicle, used regularly to top up dealer phones, was impounded. At another address, officers found and detained Levi Mukwita, the coalition's key supplier, but there were absentees. One name missing from the morning's haul was Anis Mahmoud, who had vanished weeks earlier. Unknown to officers at the time, he had fled the UK entirely, but his run didn't last. In September, Mahmoud touched down at Birmingham Airport, unaware a warrant was active. He was met on arrival by waiting officers and arrested before he could leave the terminal. The gang's confidence had kept them in motion for months, but in the space of a few hours their empire began to collapse, one front door at a time. Once the arrests were made, the real work began. Every phone, hard drive, and scrap of paper was examined. And what police uncovered told the full story, one transaction at a time. The gang had been careful, but not careful enough. Each county line was tied to a designated phone, and those phones had left a trail. Call records, message logs, and location data mapped out drug runs, pickup points, and meetups with disturbing clarity. Telecoms evidence proved crucial. GPS data placed suspects at known drop sites at the exact times customers were calling in. Texts offering deals, 2-for-1s, and new batch announcements were broadcast to hundreds of numbers in bulk. Classic county lines tactics. CCTV footage further sealed the case. Cameras outside corner shops and residential blocks captured key players topping up phones and exchanging wraps of heroin and crack for cash, or in some cases, for loyalty-based freebies. One clip even showed a known user loading a prepay card for extra drugs, a trick often used to dodge direct cash exchanges. Search teams combed through the raided properties. They found stash spots behind plasterboard, inside floorboards, and even inside washing machines. Officers seized dozens of burner phones and SIM cards, some still warm from use. Notepads with handwritten customer details, tick lists of debts owed, and coded pricing structures were recovered in bulk. Bags of heroin and crack cocaine were found weighed, bagged, and ready to go. Cash was everywhere, bundled in elastic bands, stuffed into shoes, hidden in boiler cupboards. It wasn't just loose change. We're talking tens of thousands, some still bearing residue from the drugs they'd been wrapped around. Each piece of evidence tightened the net, confirming roles, routes, and revenue. The gang's digital footprint had done what even the most covert surveillance couldn't. It told the story in their own words. By the time the case reached Birmingham Crown Court, the outcome felt inevitable. The Crown Prosecution Service presented a mountain of irrefutable evidence. Burner phones brimming with drug orders, handwritten ledgers tracking customer debts, hours of surveillance footage, intercepted messages that left no room for interpretation. The defense had little ground to stand on. All 12 defendants, faced with overwhelming proof, opted to plead guilty to conspiracy to supply Class A drugs. It was a move that spared the court a lengthy trial, but it did nothing to soften the gravity of their crimes. The judge made it clear this wasn't a minor operation or a few bad choices. This was a sophisticated, multi-layered drug trafficking network that had been flooding the streets with heroin and crack cocaine for months. Running 4 distinct lines, Rico, Diego, Figo, and Potter, they took in over 1,000 calls per day and served more than 200 users. The gang operated with structure, discipline, and intent, and now they'd be punished accordingly. Adam Iqbal, regarded as one of the gang's lead organizers, received the heaviest sentence, 12 years and 6 months. His brother Harun Iqbal, who helped oversee the Rico line, was jailed for 6 years and 4 months. Mohammed Usman, a critical link in the same operation, received 10 years and 6 months. Anis Mahmoud, who had fled to Pakistan but was arrested on his return, was handed 12 years and 10 months for his role in the Potter line. Adam Slater, working for the Diego line, was sentenced to 6 years. His co-conspirator Tiana Phillips was given 5. Yazin Sadiq, who had reactivated the Diego line and attempted to cover his tracks by switching networks, received 11 years. Mark Seeley, captured on CCTV topping up the Figo line, was sentenced to 4 years and 8 months. His associates Ilyas Sadiq and Amani Adams received 10 years and 10 months and 8 years respectively. Levi Mukwita, who acted as the coalition's supplier and facilitated drug movements across all 4 lines, was handed a sentence of 10 years and 6 months. Humair ul Rehman, working alongside Mahmoud in the Potter line, received 6 years. Altogether, the court handed down more than 100 years of prison time. A clear and deliberate message that this level of organized drug crime would not be tolerated. Detective Sergeant Craig Tennant described the case as one of the most complex and coordinated drug investigations West Midlands Police has tackled to date. Months of surveillance, data analysis, and operational planning had paid off. What began as whispers in the community turned into a full-scale takedown of a well-connected drug network spanning across Birmingham and Solihull. The gang's influence stretched far beyond the lines they controlled. They were supplying hundreds of users, feeding into a wider ecosystem of crime that included violence, intimidation, and territorial disputes. Their operations had become a fixture in some areas, phones ringing constantly, customers lining up, the flow of Class A drugs never stopping. Behind that steady rhythm was chaos, addiction, and families being torn apart. With more than 100 years of prison time handed out, the justice system sent a clear message. Sophisticated or not, large-scale drug networks will be dismantled, and those responsible will be held to account. But police know the battle isn't over. The county lines model continues to evolve. New numbers, new faces, and new ways to avoid detection. Officers from Operation Huntarian remain active, working with community partners to prevent similar networks from taking root. They continue to rely on public intelligence and local knowledge to spot early signs and disrupt emerging threats. The takedown of the Rico, Diego, Figo, and Potter lines was a major blow to drug supply in the region. But as Tennant put it, the fight continues and the pressure won't ease up. The Rico, Diego, Figo, and Potter lines controlled large swathes of Birmingham and Solihull, each one operating its own territory but feeding into the same criminal machine. The setup was smooth, profitable, and for a while completely under the radar. But once police started closing in, it became clear how fragile their operation really was. Operation Huntarian broke the gang from the inside out. The leadership structure, the supply chains, the communication methods, all exposed. What made them strong was also what made them traceable. Too many lines, too many phones, too many people involved. That level of activity always leaves a trail. This case didn't just lead to arrests, it sent a signal. No matter how carefully a crew thinks they're moving, all it takes is sustained pressure and a bit of patience to bring the whole thing down. The police didn't need to rush. They watched, they waited, and when the time was right, they took everything. For anyone stepping into the same game, the risks are now crystal clear, because the bigger the operation, the harder the fall. And when the dust settles,